This is a recording of a Coast eClinic done by Dave Connery about his Sierra Carson and Truckee layout.
Excellent.
Well, this is not going to actually be a review of my layout, but what I intend to do is just kind of share with you some of the why I modeled the railroad that I did, and some of the learnings that I had from that effort. So if you want to see my layout, if you Google YouTube and then Dave Connery, you'll get a chance to see an excellent video that John Abaticola put together of TSG Multimedia. And I think it well portrays the layout that I built. And so I won't be doing that here. So how did I get started on what I did? I built a layout. It was like a 5x9 tabletop layout, and about that time I read the book on the Sierra Railway by Dorothy Dean, and I thought, oh wow, that's a great railroad. That's what I'll call my railroad. And I started to pick out a couple of towns and name them after towns on the Sierra. And about that time, I read The Silver Short Line by Worm and DeMoro, and I thought, well, this is another great railroad. I'd really like to model this railroad. But I was between, I got rid of the layout that I had because I moved, and I was living in an apartment for about a year and a half. And that was actually, although I was disappointed at the time, it gave me an opportunity to do a lot of thinking, and that really helped. Because during that time, I had a couple chances to visit Jack Burgess's layout. And quite honestly, I was gobsmacked. I had never really thought about modeling a railroad exactly the way Jack does. In fact, of course, I never did that. But just the idea of building your whole model around what actually existed as a real railroad really thrilled me. And so I spent a lot of time getting a lot of typo maps and planning out how that railroad would work. And I try to combine the two railroads. In the Sierra book, there's a paragraph where the author talks about how the Sierra had approached the V&T about building a railroad over the Sierra between the Sierra and the V&T and connecting and making another crossing of the Sierra. When you look at topo maps, you say those guys were crazy. Their idea of going over Mono Pass was quite impossible. There had been a huge amount of tunneling involved. But what I did discover is that it might be possible to build a railroad over Carson Pass, following basically California Highway 88. And so that was the concept behind my railroad, extending the Sierra and the V&T to meet coming over Carson Pass. So a little bit of some philosophy about layouts. I think everybody should build a layout that fits their desires and their modeling. And we're all, there's a lot of different ways to do model railroading, and almost everybody is a collector to some extent, but some people, that's their primary interest, and I really appreciate that. They become collectors and often dealers. So that's one type maybe, and then another is a person that just enjoys seeing trains run. And then a third category would be model builders, and then operators, and each of those would have a very different layout. I think a collector might have a layout that maybe they got 20 tracks around their turntable so that they can display all of their steam locomotives, or large yards. And they wouldn't have any hidden trackage because they're a collector. They want people to see what they've collected. So everything would be out where you can see it. A runner might have a layout that many of us would call a bowl of spaghetti. I can remember one year we had a PCR convention down in Bakersfield, and on the layout tours, we were out near, we were on a layout tour. And we visited a guy's house, and he had this large room. Maybe it was a two-car garage. I can't remember. But it was a large room just filled with trains everywhere. And he had like an operator's console in the center. And he was sitting there, excuse me. And while we were there, I think at one time he got 10 trains running on that layout. And he was laughing. He was having such a good time. I don't think I've ever seen anybody enjoy their layout as much as he was enjoying that while we were kind of watching in kind of amazement. And it turns out he was actually an animator for Hanna-Barbera cartoons. But his layout was a perfect layout, I think, for his interest. A model builder might build a layout that again has a high percentage of structures and scenery to trackage. Build the model in a way that there's a lot of room to do a lot of building of models. While an operator would certainly try to form their layout based on how a railroad would operate, and so would have incorporated in it such things as hidden staging on both ends and typical length passing sidings and all those things that those of us who were at the SIG meet last week probably were talking about. So, but my philosophy here is build a layout that you're going to enjoy. It's for you. It's not for anybody else. So a little bit about the good, bad, and the ugly. One thing, prepare a hospitable space for your layout. When I started this layout, I'd already built a couple other layouts, but when I started this layout, I spent more than a year just getting the space ready, building walls, insulating the ceiling, putting in a pocket door, sealing it off so that virtually no dust could get into it, putting it was half of a two-car garage, putting wood floor down on top of the concrete, and then carpeting and padding on top of that, so that it was a very comfortable space to work in. Piping my house heating and air conditioning into the room so that I could maintain the environment. I highly recommend that. That was time well spent. It was hard not to want to get into building the layout, but I'm glad I took the time to do that. And the next thing is following conventional wisdom. And I don't think that's always wise because conventional wisdom, as I was just talking about, it may be somebody else's conventional wisdom. So a lot of things that other people might find right might not be right for you. The idea of using multiple levels, increasing layout size. I really believe in this. I would the next layout I would build would have multiple levels on it again. I was able to just about double the size of my layout with using 2 levels, and that gave me a whole lot more opportunity to build railroad. Using helix to save space. Helix do save space, but I think they're a terrible idea. I had a standard gauge helix that was, well, by the way, in multiple levels, you know, you're going to find that your lower level's too low and your upper level's too high. That's, I think everybody finds that. There was an article by Jack Burgess in, I think it was in Craftsman, while I was starting to build my layout, and where he went through the engineering of deciding what the levels should be, considering the height of your eyes. Could you see all the way to the back and see equipment at the back of the lower level without having to duck your head under to look underneath it, and those kind of things? Well, I wound up with 20 inches of space between my upper and lower level. Seems like a lot, but it did provide a lot of space on the lower level for people to see everything clearly, the entire scene. But when the train would go into the helix, it would be gone. It seemed like it would never come out. It would take. So eventually I just never used the helix. I ran trains on the upper level and the lower level, and that was a waste of space then they have in the helix. I wouldn't do that a second time. Developing a metal plan and sticking with it. One of the problems that a lot of us have is that we'll pick up the latest issue of Model Railroader and see some idea and say, oh, wow, I got to put that in my layout. I'll change this over here, or I'll put it instead of that. You'll never finish your layout if you keep changing it. You need to come up with a plan and a concept and stick with it and build it. One of the things that I did. And around 1995, we were getting ready for started to plan for the 2000 NMRA convention in San Jose. And as we were doing that, I said, okay, well, there's a lot of things I want to get done on my layout because I wanted to have my layout open on the tours. So I developed a Gantt chart, which is a chart that you can plan things and show interactions of projects and things. It's a project planning chart, but I had it in Excel, and I had a big chart that I printed out the parts and hanging on my wall of my garage. And I would track getting all the projects done. Well, I had all these projects to do. And in fact, ultimately, I did them all. But it was about 2006 by the time I got around to doing them, not on the deadline of getting it done by 2000. But anyway, that did help me keep me focused when I go out and see on the list that there was a project that really should get done next. And rather than doing something fun, I try to do that. And then finally, the idea of deadlines. I'm a big believer that if you schedule things like an operating session or an open house at here at Coast Division or in a convention, a PCR convention or something, those deadlines you really be motivated to get a lot done in anticipation of that. And that helps keep you on a huge project like a layout. And a layout is a project that could be measured in terms of decades, really. You need those little short-term deadlines to keep progress moving along well. So, couple things. One, this is what I use for support. It's not my idea. Actually, Jim Heidegger wrote an article about it in an early model railroader. This is the over on the left. This is Tuolumne City. This is the West Side Lumber Mill, and then on the upper part, this is Gold Hill on the V&T, and this is the Crown Point Trestle. But when you tear it, kind of open it up and see, the way I supported these peninsulas, and I had two of them, is I built this, it's kind of square on the bottom, holds the bottom, and then X-brace, whoops, oh shit, how do we go back?
I think you want to hit previous, but you can use your back arrow on your keyboard too.
Thanks, that's what I'll do. Thought that was a back arrow. No.
You may need to hit your mouse off to get that. Hit your mouse on the slides, somewhere on the slides. There you go.
Oops. There I am. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Phil. I'm really not very good at this. Anyway, the idea is you got a lot of support here, but it's really thin. You can hardly see in the behind this mill here on the left. You can hardly see the support because I painted them flat back, and they're really narrow. They're really wasp waisted, but it's very solid. And in fact, and the other peninsula, those of you who remember Denise Showalter, who sadly passed away, she was helping by painting the scenery on the upper level on the wall, and she would on work days would climb up. I'd set a ladder up, and she would climb up and sit up there. And she was a big lady, and it was perfect support for her. So that's an idea if you're thinking about a freestanding peninsula on a two-level layout, how you might want to do it. As you went into my room, I had a lift out that I never lifted out really once I got it built. But this is the door over on the left. You can see the edge of the door. This is a pocket door, and I had the scenery painted right over the door. I had two bridges going across. This is the Truckee River. This first one was this sort of a lattice bridge. When I wanted to do this was actually, I was modeling 1929, and this bridge was the bridge in use up until 1891. But I loved the bridge. There's one picture of it, so I said, okay, I'll build it from that picture. But I was concerned, it's 150 scale feet across here, and I thought, how am I ever going to build a bridge that's actually going to support the weight of my trains on the bridge? And the trains, this train's an old brass train, brass cars and brass locomotive. It weighs quite a bit. What I did was I bought some square brass tubing, and I bought a couple of pieces, and then a piece that would fit just fit inside the brass tube, the next size down. And I put those put that together so that it all total was 150 scale feet, and soldered that all up. And I had one on each side, and then I laminated on top of that like a 1x12 wood and stained wood. And actually the bottom I didn't put, I just painted the bottom black because nobody could get their head down to see up underneath it anyway. But it looked to all the world like it was a wood girder, but it never that bridge was in place 28 years. It never sagged even the slightest bit. So that was a pretty good solution to that problem. Another little thing at that scene over on the right here, you can see the SP crossing of the Truckee. And my friend Al Massey worked with me and actually did a lot of the work to get, we put in a swing, well, little kids swinging on a swing by using a Hankscraft motor that swung it back and forth, and I could turn it on, and the kid would swing back and forth. And that was always a feature, particularly of young people when they saw the kids playing on the swinging on the tire underneath the bridge. One of the things I tried to do was try to include a couple of scenes that people might recognize. One of them was my scene of Reno, where I had the sign that a lot of people have seen, one or more signs. It's changed over the years, but the sign that said the greatest little city in the world, and looking right down Virginia Street, and this is like a 5-foot deep scene right here. But almost everybody that came could remember that and remarked about that particular scene. Another scene on the lower level was the Roundhouse in Turntable at Jamestown, which I modeled completely. And many people had been up to Railtown 1897, had seen that, and so we're familiar with that scene. So by having a couple scenes that people would recognize, I think a lot of people identified with the layout when they came for visits. I also tried to include a couple things that I thought were kind of unique, and one of them was flume. I hadn't really seen flumes modeled on model railroads, although they were pretty common back in the day. And there was a flume system that brought wood from the Tahoe Basin up over Spooner Summit and down to Carson City. And there it was loaded into cars and hauled up to Virginia City as mining timbers and as cordwood for the boilers. And so that became a big business, a big part of the mining effort up at Virginia City. And so I modeled that, and it turned out pretty good. And again, I had a lot of remarks about it because it was a scene that most people had not seen on other model railroads. A couple of scenes that were special to me. One of them was the passenger depot in Sonora, a very unique building. There was some great drawings of this building in narrow gauge and short line Gazette. A lot of the buildings, as it turned out, a lot of the buildings on my two levels were actually included in drawings by Gary Caviglia that appeared in the Gazette. In this, actually, there was 3 sets of drawings of this particular building by Bob Thowd and by Gary Caviglia, and so I used those to model it. But I really always enjoyed this scene and include, of course, the passengers depot and the standard lumber company buildings that were around behind it, and then the freight depot there in Sonora. Another, to me, a critical scene was the Carson City engine house. That was on the upper level and on the end of the peninsula. And oops, I don't know what that was. Not me. Anyway, but this was a project that I kept putting off because I had never really done anything near this big or using these techniques. Ultimately, I wound up casting a bunch of wall sections. There are probably about 14 different wall sections on the fronts, the sides. These were cast. Each one of these is individual, and then I melded them together, glued them together. But I cast all these out of hydrocal. This is the back side with the atrium in the back, and this is the front. I had to shrink it a lot. The actual engine house at Carson City was 11 stalls. I modeled 8 stalls, and the total length, I cut to 43% of the total length, and it was still huge. And at one point, I had gotten photos that a photographer had taken of inside the building, and I was going to model the complete inside. And then I realized if I did that, the only way you'd see it is to lift off the roof. And if you lift off the roof, where the heck are you going to put a roof that size in the layout? There was no room to set such a thing down. You'd wind up just holding it. So I ultimately decided to attach the roof permanently and not do the interior. I tried to have little mini scenes. I tried to set it so I walk around the layout. If anywhere I was standing, I could see a mini scene. And some of them were like this over on the left here, this track crew that was putting a new siding alongside the engine house in Carson City in an adjacent little coal delivery location. And then on the lower level, I bashed together a couple of fine scale miniatures. I think Baron Gold's Tannery and the Sawyer Chemical Company into a complex that I called Hershey's. Hershey's built the plant in Oakdale in 1960. I'm modeling 1929. But I thought maybe this was what it would look like if they had built it in 1929. And so I'm showing a kind of a shift change here with all of the candy workers coming and leaving and entering the factory. And then in the Oakdale area, there are a couple things. One, there were two depots in Oakdale. The Southern Pacific Depot, we're looking at the picture over on the left, is this yellow gray roof depot, and then the Santa Fe Depot is the tile roof depot more to the left in that photo. They're about 3 blocks. They were about 3 blocks apart. Actually, the SP Depot is still there in town. It's now the Cowboy Museum in Oakdale. They were about 3 blocks apart. I didn't have that kind of room, so I put them kind of almost kitty corner from each other. But it did give me a chance to build those two buildings. And then another fun project was a Hershey. Hunt's has a plant in Oakdale, and I used 3 different kits to combine into a single complex. A couple of Campbell's kits and a Builders and Scale kit. Well, that's the end of my presentation. That's the end of the layout. This is what the layout looked like on July 12th, this past summer when I took the layout down. You can still see some of the painting on the wall, and the room was just about ready to come apart. I was tearing the wallboard off at the time. Like Jesse had mentioned earlier, the reason I wanted to be the one. I'm almost 81. I wanted to be the one that takes it down, and at this age, you never know how long you're going to have. So I thought the pandemic was a good chance. I had actually planned on being open for the 2020 PCR convention in Concord. I was really disappointed when that couldn't happen, and I decided, well, I'm not going to wait for another one. I'm going to take it down, and I'm glad I did. It's allowed me, it's given me the freedom to move on to some other projects that I'm finding equally exciting. And I had I had helped widows with 3 of my friends' layouts, taking them apart. And I often would joke that when it came time, when something happened to me, my wife would probably call the disposal company to get a garbage bin. The call before she dialed 911 to get the emergency people that are coming to see me. But I like I say, I really am glad that I was the one and didn't leave that for someone else to handle. So if you got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I guess everybody's muted. They probably can't speak.
Well, so Dave, you had some wonderful structures on that layout. Where did they end up?
I gave everything away. There's 2 young modelers. They're not NMRA members, I don't believe. One models the Sierra, and one models the V&T. I've known them since they were about 15 or 16. Mentored the Sierra modeler a lot over the years, and so I invited both of them to come over and then take anything they wanted off their part of the layout. So one had his a chance to take anything off the upper level, and the other the lower level. And then I'm in a round robin modeling group, and I just invited them over one at a time. This was during the pandemic. Just come over, and then anything that was left on the layout to take it. Ultimately, I found by giving it away, I found a home for everything on the layout. I think I have just a couple of little structures or something left on the shelf.
That's great. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Well, before you go,
Dave,
Dave, let's add, so if you had it to do over again, so, that's always the interesting question. What are the 2 or 3 things that you would do differently now that looking back on the whole experience, what are the 2 or 3 things you would do differently?
Well, I still love those 2 railroads. So I'd still have a 2-level layout. I'd model the 2 railroads. I would not build helixes between them. I had both a 2-track standard gauge helix and a single HON3 helix because I did have some HON3 track on both levels. So that is one thing that I would do differently. The second thing is I would leave out I would force myself to leave out a couple of scenes. I had too many scenes too close together. Typically, a train, the locomotive is entering one town when the caboose is just leaving the town behind it. They were just too close together. So I would give myself a little bit more room. But it really gave me a lot of great opportunities for modeling projects.
Cool.
Dave, can you explain your rationale behind your Hershey's plant? I really like that model. It's super cool with all the people in white on the shift change. How did you come up with a design for that? Did you just totally freelance it, or did you look at old chocolate plants, or how'd you come up with that?
I totally freelanced it. I had those 2 fine scale miniatures kits, and I didn't have any use for them, and I had a space set aside for the Hershey plant, and then I just put them together into a single complex. And it turned out pretty well. I was happy with it. It was a lot of people would mention it. I used for the signs. I used Hershey wrappers that I cut out the words for to put up on the wall. So that's it. But it was totally freelance, and that was a lot of fun to do.
I grew up in Modesto, and we used to go tour the Hershey plant when it was in there, and it was always the highlight of the school year to go.
Right,
to Hershey.
sure, yeah.
Good thing you didn't live in Golden, Colorado, because the highlight of would have been touring the Coors Brewery. Different childhoods for different people. I'm sorry. Well, thanks, Dave. That was absolutely wonderful. I think it's great to learn, especially for those that are thinking and planning layouts, to learn from other folks. So, if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and formally move on to kind of show what you're modeling.
Hey, Phil.
Yes,
this
sir.
is Jack.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to make a comment on what Dave said. The thing he made mention of there, that he's getting up in age, and he's the one who wanted to tear his layout down. In my organization, South Bay Historic Railroad Society, we get people calling us all the time with donations, family members, wives, and stuff like that. And they'll donate the husband's or father's layout to us, but we end up having to go in and tear it down. And a lot of times those things are built not to come down. So you go in with a saw and start cutting up. So kind of think of that as you're working on your layout. How's it going to come out? Just a comment from me.
Well, and not just the layout. I think also things like, when you place a building, you don't necessarily think that you're going to take it out, but you've got to remember at some point it probably will come out. It's not going to be a permanent part of the world at that location.
Exactly.
So, thinking through a little bit of can I or someone in the future take this out and keep it in one piece is probably an interesting thought process.
Yes.
Definitely. Yeah, Phil, I was able to remove that. I had that Carson City engine house on about a 4x4 piece of homosote underneath, and I was able to take it out in a single piece and ultimately give it to the young man that models the VNT.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, I just want to point out, I was 74 when I was faced with building a new layout after there was a ceiling leak and a collapse in a roof. And I certainly cut back and just am building a place to display models rather than trying to go for an operational layout in a very small space I had anyway. But you think, in thinking about how I was going to build it, I was thinking, I made sure that everything was literally, you could be moved out and would make it through the door.
Yeah, hey Dave, I'd just like to comment. I was one of those people that walked to the door and saw your layout at the 2000 convention. I was getting back into the hobby at the time, and it was very inspirational. I remember many of those scenes like it was yesterday.
Thank you, Jim.
Fantastic modeling. And second question is, that last slide showed a nice wire hanging from the ceiling. Did you take a swing on that like the kid on the swing?
Yeah, maybe it was still alive at the time. Probably not.
So the real important question is, what replaced that space in your garage? Did you get a new car or?
No, it's just workspace now.
Ah,
And I'm part of an effort, and maybe in a couple 3 months we'll have something to display here. An effort to build the San Ramon branch in N scale.
Oh,
A portable.
cool.
You're lucky, unlucky to be in N scale because with those Type 18 kits in HO that came out, you can just do every station now.
Well, actually, I have a cricket machine, and after Ray Davis's presentation a couple of months ago, I've actually created the Type 18 depot in cricket, and so I can, and I have cut out a couple, three of the depots.
Cool. That's good.
Yeah, I was going to say the deconstruction part there, Dave, is that the pandemic forced me, well, I shouldn't say forced me, but gave me the opportunity to do a lot of construction on the Pink Lady. So I did a lot of ripping out too. You know, those people that say screw from underneath up into risers, you know, they really do know what they're talking about, you know. But I found removing a lot of stuff, the Sawzall was really handy. And I've still got big chunks of the railroad sitting in the garage, and I'm trying to figure out where to put them. So, you know, a lot of times what you think you might want to save may not be possible, you know, 10 years, 20 years from now. So just have fun building, enjoy while you can, you know.
One of the things I did, you might find interesting, instead of L girder, I used what I call T girder. And instead of just a girder with access on one side, I put it's on top of a 1x4, I put a 1x3 with 1 inch overhanging on each side. And that way I could screw up in from either the front side or the back side, depending on which was most convenient. And I found that handy on a number of occasions when I had other things in the way, so that only one side really was a good screwing location.
I think the rule that I'm abiding by this time, I'm still working on staging, is that if it will never be covered, a screw from above is fine. If it has a possibility of being covered, there will be no screws going in from the top. So.
Great idea. I'm rebuilding a fence that was 25 years ago.
Hey, Steve, you're really muffled. I think you've got to get closer to your mic. Your mic may be covered or something.
Never mind.
There, that's better now.
Oh, okay. I'm rebuilding a fence that's on one side of the house for various reasons. And I'm using screws, and I'm finding it a lot better that way, because as pieces rot, you can replace just the pieces you want to. So, and it's also easier on your shoulders because you're not hammering, you know. And so I've learned to love screws, you know, and for assembling and disassembling fences and stuff. Anyway, it fits in with your layout stuff. You never know when you build a fence if you're going to be around 20 years from now and have to rebuild it. So I'm finding that all the pressure treated stuff is salvageable, and I've only had to replace 2 or 3 of the posts. And but the rest of it, I'm replacing with pressure treated. I'm reusing the lumber. At $7 a piece of board for the fence these days, I'm glad to be able to do that. Plus, I'm going up 1.5 feet to give my neighbor more privacy. Long story, but screws even outside are a great thing. You know, for rebuilding in the future, especially.
Yeah. One thing I found in just doing my little tiny layout was that poplar wood really looks good, and it almost gives you a furnished effect with just a basic L girder. Oh, and it's easily it's readily available in Home Depots and other wood stores. They have all sorts of sections of it. Anyway, instead of just using pine.
I had another question for Dave. I wanted to know how you balanced building models with building the layout. What sort of a balance you created with that? Because I find myself, you know, building models and taking forever to do something, and then the layout construction stops. Did you have a scheme for moving forward?
Well, Guy, actually, what I would not allow myself to build a model until I'd finished another item on the layout. I just had that rule, so I'd force. Okay, I've done that particular section over there. Now I can build this boxcar, and then when I do that, it's time to go back and get the next job on the layout, just to try to discipline myself. Otherwise, I really enjoy building freight cars. I might spend all of my time doing just that.
Sounds like discipline that I may not have, but
well, I don't know that I have much discipline. That's why I made those silly rules. But I think discipline is really critical if you're ever going to finish a layout.
Absolutely.
That's an interesting thought. Of it becomes a lot more like work when you're doing a bunch of things you don't like, so you can do things you do like.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thought process of balancing that. Coming back, I think, to Dave's comments about different kinds of modelers. Sometimes I think expectations of others drive us to do things that, you know, you're not like Dave, where you just say, I just want a place to show my models, versus trying to build a full layout and have operations on it. I mean, those are kind of, if you're more into building models, sometimes feeling the pressure to build a full layout may be less enjoyable than just building models and having a place to store to show them.
I think it's very interesting, Dave's comment, this concept of finished your layout. Strange concept.
And actually that may be an objectionable concept, because I've heard that when you finish your layout, they put you in the narrow motel and the groundhog becomes your mailman. But I had a couple of comments, and I'm working on trying to put together some photographs to share my current project, which is building the Oregon City Bridge into Winchester, Virginia, which obviously does not exist. But that idea of following the conventional wisdom, I think that's a lesson for me anyhow, that has come very, very late in life. I'm now 80, and thanks to Jim Radke and Steve Van Meter and a group of other guys, including Seth Newman, I think all of them dug their way out of the cuckoo's nest. I have a layout with two helixes, and I think I'm now into at least the 13th year of finding out how to build a layout. I wish we'd have had this Zoom thing 10 years ago. I might be done.
Good Good to see you today, Bob.
Yeah.
I was going to say one thing I've discovered as I get older, and I think I'm approach this as a young dad with, well, not so young dad, but a dad with 2 young kids. And I would go and buy the cheapest, least expensive thing that I could find, including the lumber and everything else. And I've truly enjoyed just going down to Ashby Lumber and saying, I want 20 of these. And some guy goes with a forklift and comes back with 20 of them and shoves them in my car, you know? So I have to admit, I'm truly enjoying that part of the hobby now.
Good.
Well, one of the things, my layout, parts of it was like 34, 35 years old. And things would go wrong. And as I got older, I found it harder and harder to fix them. I'd crawl under the layout and have a great deal of trouble getting myself in the position to do the soldering that I needed to do. And when I'd get done and crawl out, I'd realize that I now created 2 new problems in fixing the one problem that I had. And so just maintaining the layout became more and more onerous as time went on. So I guess another learning is I never thought I'd get to here. I never thought about what it was going to be like when I got older. And it, you know, going back, I'd say, okay, I needed to think how I do things in a way that's going to be a lot easier to maintain them when I'm not as agile as I was when I started.
And I think the other challenge that a layout of the age that yours had was it went through some probably fairly major technology transitions from DC to DCC,
Right.
how we think about doing wiring, how we think about, you know, and then the advent of thinking about trying to do operations, which, you know, if a layout's 30, 35 years old, you got to think about that. That means it was started back in the 80s. And you got to think about how different the 80s and even the 90s was versus today, because so much changed between 95 and about 2005, 2010 in the hobby. And so a lot of those layouts there's a lot of retrofitting, which makes them even more complex. If you start from scratch today, I think with today's technology, and, you know, I think Seth was talking about was, you know, using structured wiring. You know, you can use structured wiring now in ways that eliminate a lot of those issues, that it kind of showed up because you took something that was kind of designed analog and tried to make it digital. So
yeah, the layout underwent, you know, it was originally built it started in the 80s, in late 80s, it was all DC. And then I started to convert to the Keller onboard system. That was very resistance sensitive. So I wound up using a bus line. It was either a number 6 or number 8 gauge wire for my main bus to eliminate the resistance loss. Well, of course, then later on, as I converted first to Digitrax and then later to North Coast, that bus was way over gauged.
right. Well, and the fact that it was a parallel bus probably introduced all sorts of interesting anomalies on the DCC signal too.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's really interesting that, you know, it's kind of your layout reflects a point in time, and adapting it's kind of is often a challenge. So
Yeah, Phil, I totally agree with that. I actually think when you start a layout, you are sort of reflective of the technology that's available at that moment.
Right.
And that, you know, there's a few upgrades, like you say, you can kind of do, but then you're kind of stuck, you know, unless you want to go through and do a lot of extra work to redo stuff. And if you're
Right.
building a big layout, that's not really an option.
Right.
Exactly. And it's even changing more, you know, depending upon your view, whether this is one of the things Seth and I was talking about, you know, I think there's going to be an interesting philosophical view of layout construction of this concept of star wiring, where you basically run cheap Cat5 cables out to everything and bring it all back to a central location where you have your intelligences. Or the other option, which is the LCC system, which is you run a bus around the layout and you have all these little smart nodes out on the bus. And both have advantages and disadvantages, but I think there's a really interesting philosophical question coming if you're building a layout today. which one of those two strategies do you choose? And I think they're not mutually exclusive per se, but there's really an interesting, and it's a technology question about how much you centralize intelligence versus distributing it out on a bus. Because once you put it on a bus, then you've got to troubleshoot the bus, and it makes the troubleshooting more difficult. It makes installation easier in some ways, but makes troubleshooting more difficult. But using Cat5 defined wiring, what we're doing in Pleasanton is we've actually defined the Cat5 cables, so everything will run back to 3 locations with single Cat5 cables. There's no intermediate terminations anywhere. You basically come off of the outputs, either Chubb or the CP node, and run a Cat5 cable right to the to the target on a signal or to the turnout. And so under the layout, there's no terminations whatsoever. There's just the endpoints and the computer equipment. So that's kind of a star wiring versus running the DCC bus and an LC bus around under the tracks and putting intelligence out in little blocks everywhere. It's going to, I think it's a really interesting question if you're thinking about designing a layout with what I'll call the modern capabilities. So something Seth and I were talking about. Yeah, sorry, Ken.
You might also think that in 5 years, all of that will be obsolete with dead rail.
But you still have to have this for signaling and turnout control and detection.
Yeah,
and those
that's
things.
true.
That's it's almost more for that than the bus power, than the track power. But yeah, and in fact, Seth and I were talking about maybe trying to put a session together about that as a topic for the convention about, if you're starting a layout today, this choice you have of technology, because there's one set of technologies in the telecom industry that's great about wiring. There's another set of technologies coming out of the model railroad industry about distributed intelligence. And by the way, this is a battle that happens in high tech. Do you push intelligence out to the edge or do you run it in the cloud? It's a huge battle in technology of where you put stuff. And I think it's an interesting choice for us now as model railroaders.
We went through
I was going to say, what Ken is saying and what you're basically saying here is if you're building a layout, I don't know about anybody else, but my layout has the great unfinished has been going on for decades. I just took out like a third of the layout and put in new trackage and that sort of stuff. It's upgrading. And how do you upgrade? And what are you upgrading to?
Yep.
And that sort of stuff. And that's what is really reflecting of the state of the hobby today. I would never obviously upgrade to a DC system.
Right.
But, but I'm locked into maybe this or maybe that from 10 years ago when I did a last thing. So that's something that if you talk about build layout design, you have to sort of think ahead to upgrading.
Yep.
You try to future-proof. I mean, the communications industry has spent an awful lot of time dealing with that, as Phil kind of outlined. So, we share, well, along with Charlie and Dave, I guess for that matter, several of us, long careers in an industry that's grappled with this for as long as I've been involved, and in the commercial world, you're kind of dominated by labor costs. So we don't mind throwing a little extra wire at something if it saves us from having to roll a truck to go out and deal with it, because that's hundreds of dollars. I mean, that was hundreds of dollars even in the 80s. Whereas a model railroader might consider that entertainment. So, there are somewhat different objectives here, but all of us, looking at this screen are not of the age that we like to crawl around under things a lot. It's first of all, there's a lot of thinking about how we're going to get back up once we've gotten down.
Well, and I think
So
the other thing too is that as you complete your layout, the amount of maintenance you have to do is directly proportional to the level completed, right? So if you completed 50% of the layout, you have X amount of maintenance you have to do on that. If you complete another 25%, your maintenance goes up by 50%. And I think that was kind of what Dave was commenting on was, eventually the maintenance load becomes a challenge. So I think that's important when you when you start thinking about a layout today, to really think through, well, when I get this done, what's it going to take to maintain it? How challenging is it going to be to maintain it? Because I have a funny feeling, if you talk to a lot of modelers who've completed or built big layouts, that may be a discussion that is significant. Just the amount of maintenance and how much time it takes to keep it running once you get it completed. And so maybe the thought process of choosing technologies and implementation methodologies to minimize maintenance might be actually a good strategy for long-term enjoyment. They were just thought processes.
Hey, Phil, you forgot the third category, prototypical wiring. If you're doing 1960s, you shouldn't have anything that wasn't around in 1960. You know? My second thing is I challenge.
We don't allow any cell phones in the layout room because damn, they didn't exist in 1960.
Can we use punch blocks in 1960
gurus to come up with a wireless thing that works in the next 2 or 3 years that I can focus on? So
yeah, we gave Dave Adams a hard time about the computer generated switch list for his layout.
And by the way, talking about some nice surprises. So we're for the layout in Pleasanton, we're doing signaling. We bought all of these custom signals, and it turns out they were made for Atlas, and all the signals, the heads, which have 3 LEDs in each one because they're searchlights, basically are wired to an RJ14 jack, which is the 6-pin jack with 4 pins. And it's wired, black is ground, and then the red, yellow, and green wires are wired to the LEDs. So when you come down to actually building the layout, we're going to build a board and talking to Seth about getting these built. Basically, you have a board that's got an RJ45 on one side, and on the other side has 2 of these RJ14s. And the idea is you just plug the signals into that, plug in the RJ45, the other end plugs into the CRMRI, and you're done. So literally, there's no soldering under the layout. There's no wiring under the layout. There's no screws under the layout. It's all plug and play.
Right, and you avoid having to deal with little fiddly bits of 30 gauge magnet wire, which
exactly.
Is lots
oh
of
my
fun.
God! But you lose all the entertainment value.
I go to the layout with a soldering iron and having solder drip in your face.
That's right, Jesse. Real men like solder in their face.
But
I really don't mind soldering, but I really don't like it near my eyes.
And to some extent, having been in technology for a lot of years, and actually in the book I wrote, there's a chapter about where you put intelligence in distributed systems, and it actually is very fundamental. The concept of these distributed little intelligence nodes on a bus, I think personally is pretty questionable. The cost of wiring from where the intelligence, where the action needs to be back to a point of centralized intelligence on our layouts with Cat5 cable is so inexpensive. I think the complexity of distributing things and having to troubleshoot them in that distributed network may be much more than it's worth. And I think it's a really interesting, and the whole LCC technology, it's really cool. But it kind of feels to me a lot like pushing more intelligence down to your PC. When you look at today, like the intelligence that's recording this conference is not on my PC. It's up in the cloud. It's running in a server out in the internet somewhere. So it's been centralized, and we're using the network to get us all back to it. So it's a really interesting philosophical discussion about how you do this. So
to pick that up, let me add one more thing. A lot of what we're dealing with here to some extent are, it's beyond philosophical, it's more theological. And in the early days of the internet, you have to realize this was originally the ARPANET, and the ARPANET was designed to develop a survivable communication system so that if somebody nuked a couple of your nodes, quite literally, the rest of them would be able to route around the damage and you could still launch a counterstrike. Now, that's really important if you're a SAC. It's not very important in your basement. And what happened is that concept kind of rolled into a lot of people who are very suspicious of central network operators, and in some countries you can imagine why. But in our case, it was just people who didn't like AT&T and MCI, and they wanted intelligence out at the nodes where they could control it. But I mean, kind of what Phil is saying is, in your basement, you control it. So if you don't trust you to manage your network, you got bigger problems than distributed intelligence. And
so I'm going to argue. I'm all a buzz here. We're going to be gone for an hour now, Seth. I'd argue the other way. I'd argue for divide and conquer, right? The idea of the distributed intelligence means I can have intelligence on one corner of the layout. It controls just a few devices. I can isolate it from the rest of the layout. I can debug it, test it, and I've only got a few things to debug, as opposed to a central point of failure. So
yeah,
I
but
just
Charlie, that
tossed
means
that wrench out.
you have to debug it in 10 places if you have 10 nodes. I mean, the average user, it's all he can do to use JMRI on a centralized system. And I mean, it's wonderful that you could have distributed intelligence, but having a 10-node distributed layout basically means that 10 nodes each have to have their own individual model of the world. Now, it can be a little simple. They're only concerned about their direct connections, but you have 10 of them, no two alike. And that's asking, people who don't have sophisticated network management tools a lot to go out to 10 different nodes and manage them individually. I think it's much simpler for a real-world modeler to log into JMRI once and do it from one place. And at that point, LCC versus CMRI versus LocoNet becomes a matter of plumbing, and you don't really care. So just centralize it and do it once. Everything's easy to get to. You can have one place where the backboard's at a convenient height and you're not on your knees, a convenient distance, and you're not constantly doing this. One management tool,
Except that I'd argue about that single point of failure too, right? You got a single point of failure, and when it's down, the whole layout's down.
Yeah, but so what? If one of your nodes is down, you're screwed up your operating system session anyway. And it's not like, the Russians are going to get a leaker through and blow up New York. It just means, you have to go fix a node.
Well, I think the other thing that's really interesting is you've got to differentiate the DCC track wiring from any signaling or what I'd call control wiring. And what's interesting, so we're going through this DCC rebuild in Pleasanton, and the original thought was to put a DCC bus around the layout. And the more we looked at that, we realized the minute you put detectors in, and we're using the Chubb has a 12 slot kind of motherboard for detectors. If you're doing 12 detectors and you look at a location and you look at kind of the footprint for 12 detectors, and because we've got two main lines, you've got to have separate detectors for each main line because we want to drop back to DC. So they have to be isolated on two different motherboards. So what that means is if you take an area in the layout, you're putting 24 detectors essentially in a location. And if you look at the footprint of those detectors around, turns out it's about 15, 20 feet in either direction. And it doesn't make sense to have a bus. It makes much more sense to actually make those star wired also. So essentially what we've got is the locations where we've got the CRMI equipment. We're also putting a booster, and then we're putting circuit breakers there and then running an individual feed out to one of those detector panels and then starring out. So again, it's all a star.
But it's not a single star, Phil. That's the point. It's hierarchy, right? Well, you've broken it down into a collection of stars.
Sure,
right.
But it's structured wiring.
That's the same way as that's the same way as a turnout, right? You've got the RJ45 runs out to the turnout. You've got a point there, and then it stars from there to the turnout controls or the signal control. So it is that idea, but it's the idea of that adaption. What's interesting about the adaption is on each location, and I'll show you what, because it might be interesting. Let me put this up. We just finished this, so we're just working it. This is.
By the way, we're into religious wars here.
Said it was theological, and I'm afraid we're putting a bunch of atheists to sleep.
I was afraid that was going to be the next step.
Gee,
so
I had no idea that this was a South Bay tech group here.
So anyway, this is RJ45 standard wiring for pinouts and colors for through cables, and this maps that to those RJ14s for the signals. So one Cat5 can support two signal heads, or it can support a turnout with the motor and the sensing for inputs to CMRI. Or basically we put two Cat5s, two RJ45s for a Chubb detector panel. And so basically what you've got at each place in the field, you've got this predefined mapping of how that Cat 5 breaks up to that location. So in other words, this Cat 5 only supports that one thing at the other end. And so it's really easy to troubleshoot. And the cool thing is you can unplug the Cat 5 from the CRMI termination, plug it into a tester, and have push buttons and test everything. Right? So you can have a push button, you plug it in, and you've got 6 LEDs, and you can read the detectors. Or you plug in a tester to a turnout, and you can turn the turnout and run it back and forth, and you can see it change. So you can actually test both ends with testers very easily because the cables are always in between.
So no argument against using standard cables, standard pinouts, and standard conventions, regardless of whether it's, absolutely.
Yep. So, and I'm amazed how inexpensive Cat 5 cable is. And
because model railroaders are using it everywhere and the prices come down.
Right. That's right. Actually, the one interesting thing is that, and we're going to try to retrofit this, if you're building a layout today, the other thing I would encourage thinking about is putting a cable tray in. Actually build a cable tray to lay cables in like we do. And, if you ever go into a data center, you see these metal trays, they're like this wide that have just a whole bunch of cables thrown in them. The idea of putting a 6-inch wide cable tray running all under your layout where you can just put a Cat 5 in, you'll identify it at one end, put it in the tray, bring it out the other end, have it identified. You don't have to worry where it is in between because you got the two ends identified, but you've just got an easy way to run cabling instead of, putting it up with 1,000 zip ties to the bottom of the layout.
Well, I use ring runs. I got the old Teflon D-rings, although, if you want to do it inexpensively, shower curtain rings work pretty well.
Yep.
Because
it'd be cool to have ironwork just because ironwork is cool, but
cable trays take depth, and a lot of guys have multi-layer layouts, and you just don't want that extra depth. I agree. Doing what Seth is doing with the rings works great.
Yep.
I think this once again gets back to the fact that if you're going to build a layout, a modern layout nowadays is probably sectional is a really good way to go. Which is actually one reason why I haven't had to build a new layout from scratch, because all my previous layouts to the one I have in my bedroom right now were one piece that fits in only one unique location. And every time I started, along on this route, I had to move for work. So I wound up tearing out 3 or 4 layouts in the past. And this time I went with 3 4-foot sections, by 2-foot sections that are sectional. And I haven't had to tear it out yet. Now I haven't made much progress, but at least I haven't had, it's still there.
Cool. Well, I think we beat the layout to death. Anybody got any interesting projects to show for the week?
Hey.